Hi, and welcome back to Continual. Here tonight, we're here to talk all about noir fiction and science fiction. How do the two blend and mix? And we're going to hit on some fan favorites, as well as some things you may never have seen or heard of. I'm your host, Jim Nettles. And before we go too far down this path, let's see who else is going to be walking down these back alleys with us. So, Russ, you're up first.
Hey guys, I'm Russ Colchamiro with Crazy 8 Press. I write sci-fi thrillers and noir, and some space opera, some crime, some mystery, and a little bit of horror.
Elektra?
I'm Elektra Hammond. I'm a writer and an editor. I focus mainly on alternate history, but I love mystery, so it all kind of blends together.
Lola?
In my head, anyway.
Well, you know. Lola?
My name's Lola Lariscy. I write science fiction and I like doing these shows.
So I actually want to start with what in a lot of ways is kind of the iconic blend of science fiction and the noir elements. And I'm going to start with Blade Runner. So it's set, even though it really wasn't the first, there have been a lot of films, it in a lot of ways established a lot with a number of genres. You know, we see this as the really heavy anchor to cyberpunk in film. And a lot of those elements, we see the heavy noir mystery elements. Obviously, it's heavy sci-fi. So in many ways, this is the classic sci-fi noir movie. So Russ, I'm going to start with you on this one. So, you know, where do you land on Blade Runner? I've seen, I think, all 12 different iterations and versions of it at this point, all the different endings and whatnot. But yeah, for you, where'd you land on Blade Runner?
So I'm a huge fan of both Blade Runner movies, actually. I think that I was sort of really stunned that the sequel was as good as it was. I had, kind of no realistic expectation that it would be anything better than, average at best. But I think it did a really great job of expanding that world. But I think what's interesting is that, over the years, Blade Runner is really kind of like the gold standard for this futuristic noir. But what gets lost in the shuffle is the original book, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep?
Mm-hmm.
And, the movie and the book, they're similar, but really the movie's quite different. In the book, Deckard is married. And that character is, obviously nowhere to be found in the movie. And there's a much greater emphasis on sort of, this idea of electric sheep. Sort of there are these artificial animals that are very expensive because there are no animals in that world, which has all been sort of excised from the movie, which makes complete sense because the movie takes on more of a kind of a little bit more of a slow burn thriller kind of a approach to it, whereas the book does not. The book is much more of a character piece and, kind of really delves into, Deckard is a little bit more, he's more copish in the book than in the movie. There's a strong case to be made that Deckard is the real villain of Blade Runner. Think about, the replicants they're bred for slavery and with a short lifespan. And the question really becomes, and we get it at kind of at that, that incredible scene at the end, where Roy Batty is saying, look, I've seen things that you would never believe. I was bred for this. And it's all going to be, washed away like tears in the rain. It's time to die. But just think about it. If you personally you woke up one day and, you're fully formed as an adult and they said, okay, go work the most brutal, dangerous, horrible jobs imaginable. Anywhere that we put you, that's what you're going to do basically 24/7 for about 5 years and then you're dead. You might have some opinions about that. But when we're introduced to them, their narrative is really kind of put forth that these are these dangerous criminals who are running around the streets and they have to be kind of put down. And when you watch it initially, I know I did, because the movie came out, what was it, 80 or 81? I was kind of too young to really kind of appreciate the layers there. But there's a really strong case to be made that if you had told, or if the story had been told really from the replicant's point of view only, that Deckard would be like this, they would be the real criminals here. I mean, think about what they're doing. They bred me into slavery, and because I dared to say I don't want to do this anymore, they're going to hunt me down and kill me because I'm the threat. But I didn't set up this system, you know what I mean? So I think that kind of, there's more conversations that have gone on about this over time, but just as a body of work by itself, not only does, Deckard, as this, Blade Runner, hunt down these criminals, these replicants, there's also that really kind of very uncomfortable scene where he, all but, rapes his, he almost sexually assaults his love interest. He's really not such a good guy here. And yet, we're watching it from his point of view, and we're supposed to sort of, bond with him because he's the quote unquote hero of the narrative. I'm not so sure that's actually true.
Well, and there's one other thing that when we look about it now, because I remember the first time I saw it as a kid, right? Is you have Harrison Ford cast in this role right after Star Wars, right? It's that, oh, okay, great. We're going to go get another fun ride of Han Solo. And this is a very different world, which brought a lot of slap back at the time, which I think also lends a lot of interesting thought that had to have gone into casting him for that role. Right, and how it was marketed and handled to go from that anti-hero to, I think there's a lot of arguments about which side does he fall on. So Elektra, what about you and Blade Runner?
Okay, well, first, I hear what Russ is saying, and I'm waiting for this to go viral so that there'll be a Cobra Kai-like thing made from Blade Runner, branding him as the villain and the replicants as the heroes. I'm just waiting for it. I mean, that's the way that worked. Also,
all they did was kill their makers. It's okay.
The fully formed people. I just watched Orphan Black Echoes.
Oh, how was that?
The fully formed people thing just hit me right in the feels. I have a lot of opinions about this, having, seen the first one, I guess around college time. And first, the city was like a character. The way they put it together, it was just so futuristic and vertical and beautifully put together. And you could see the different strata of the rich and the poor, and it really gave you an idea of a future in which things weren't really working out the way we might have hoped, that wasn't here. And I really liked the way the city became a character. And I loved, irregardless of everything else, I loved the ending of whether or not Deckard was a replicant himself that had been placed in the job of evaluating other replicants, that was left up in the air in the movie. That just, I like when they leave things so you can sit around and spend hours discussing, but they gave you this clue and they gave you that clue. And obviously if he did this, he isn't. And obviously if he did this, he is. And, that he sometimes had sympathy for them, and that, well, sometimes he didn't. It leaves you with a ping pong ball of maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But I've always thought it was a beautifully constructed movie, and it has all those really wonderful elements of noir that you sit there and you watch it and you stare at the screen and you cannot tear yourself away from it. It just envelops you. It has that feeling, irregardless of the details, which are also wonderful. But I love the feeling I get from it.
And also remember at the very end, Roy Batty, he had Deckard. I mean, he could have killed him very easily, and he saved him. Roy Batty in his final moments showed more humanity in that moment than maybe any of the characters showed in the whole movie.
Well, yeah, there were an awful lot of people in that movie that were not very human.
Or certainly not decent.
Lola? Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
And that's one of the things they seem to be trying to show. That, being a human doesn't mean you're going to act humane.
For sure.
And you're on mute, Lola. And one of the things I want to dive into when we get here is talk a lot about all of these elements that make up the noir part of the story. But go ahead, Lola.
Well, that's kind of what I was going to say. I think this is the first time that I'd ever seen, the classic template of noir, the detective, the femme fatale, the dark lighting, the ominous, grim exteriors. That's the first time I'd ever seen it with an overlay of science fiction. And it just blew my mind. It was so cool. It was like, it's the future, but yet it looks like the 40s. What's happening here? My mind's exploded, but no, it's 2019. Pretty crazy.
And when do I get my flying car?
Oh, it's
right.
They had flying cars.
What's interesting there, though, if you think about it, noir typically implies, kind of this sort of like darker, brooding, kind of gritty world, whereas sci-fi is setting. And what they did was they did both, right? We got the sci-fi element, right? The futurism, the flying cars, these expansive cities, the technology is there, but it's not Star Wars technology. It's, futuristic technology, but we get that real setting where Elektra, you're absolutely right that the setting was another character and very rich, and Blade Runner couldn't be Blade Runner without the setting. There's no doubt about it. But that noirish, it's very, it's always raining. It's dark, most of the scenes are at night, so it's dark. So you get a lot of the neon glow. And, I'm a sucker for
the neon.
Any neon that reflects off of puddles in the street, that's just, I don't know. There's just something about that kind of always draws me to it. But that where they really blended the two of them, the gritty and the sci-fi, they got it so right.
You had your flying cars, but you were flying them between these tall buildings. There wasn't a feel of expansive. It was a feel of crowded and
oppressed.
Yeah, exactly, Lola. It was oppressive.
Yeah, well, it's what we call
had the technology, but it was only available to the rich when they could get out of the cities.
Yeah, it's what we call in the real estate world. There's density there.
Well, so at Dragon Con for the 40th anniversary, we went and heard Edward James Olmos was speaking. Talking about the 40th anniversary, and James Hong was there. Got to meet both of them for that.
Yeah.
And what was really kind of cool was because that was a very young Edward James Olmos, right?
Right.
He was talking about the fact that there was a whole lot going on where they were trying to figure out the story and the set and everything. There was still so much going on. They gave him a lot of latitude. So and originally his role was basically a scene or two, really, really minor character. And so he was allowed to go create his costume and sort of pick out elements of it from wardrobe to create this very mix of urban and city and very 40s, but yet still a little bit of the modern feel. The other thing that was interesting was he created the language they used in the movie that was that blend of all the different dialects and languages and things that they used. And he just went and sat down and kind of created that blended language that was used. There was a lot of interesting stuff that came out of that it was very much a collaborative effort to create all of this. But the funniest part was this. He tells the story, and I think this fits into it. is that he is standing in the back of the room when they're doing the classic scene, him and Deckard going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And he says one of the worst things you can do as an actor is to just stand there, because if you're not doing anything at all, you stand out more than if you're just fidgeting with something. He says, there's a piece of chewing gum wrapper on the table. I picked it up and I start fidgeting with it and doing the origami. At the end of it, because while he did it, he did the origami. I think it was, I don't remember if it was the duck. I think it was the duck. Had to be the duck. He does the duck and they go, cut. And he puts the duck, or he puts the duck on the table. They go, cut. And he goes, quack. The reason the way he told the story was, the reason for all the origami was he did that when he would get bored in a scene. And that has now become such a fundamental part of the story, is how those little things have shaped and sculpted it. But it was a whole thing of, oh yeah, get that. And these elements that made their way in seemingly by accident from the stories that he told.
Happy accidents, but that also really sculpted the narrative of the story.
So with that kind of that idea, when we talk about noir elements, the setting is, and Russ, you were going down the path of one of my questions, the setting is critical, often more critical than the characters themselves. And so if you are in that city, how do you find ways of creating that really good blend of sci-fi? And Elektra, I'm going to start with you on this one, since Russ, you started going down this path. How do you find and get those really strong elements of the noir, but yet also keep those sci-fi elements so that it's not entirely our world?
Well, I thought the flying cars were a huge piece of that, because maybe it could have been a city off in Asia somewhere where I'd never been. That, maybe it could have been Taipei or something, or a piece of Hong Kong where the buildings were really close, right up until the point where they got into the flying car and started maneuvering between things. That really gave it that feel, because pretty much the buildings were buildings and the furniture was furniture, and the neon was fun, but it was, again, we were back in the 80s looking at the future. I love the aspect of, once you got down on the street, it was very busy, and there were, noodles. It seemed to be any place where you could go, a walking market. And suddenly we were someplace where you could get lunch and walk, but there was no place to sit anymore. Everything was too hyper crowded. And the wealth gap we have now seemed to have expanded exponentially, where everybody was crowded into the city to the point where you weren't sitting down, you were just walking around, and you were living in these tall buildings. And then when the rich had their spaces, they had more space than everybody else, to even more of an extreme than they do now. And that really threw me. Back then, it was just, wow, these guys, nice stuff. And then, of course, the replicates, they can just have people to do things for them.
So Lola, any other thoughts on kind of the environment of the noir environment, but in a sci-fi world, not necessarily even in Blade Runner, just in general? You're on mute.
They found some pretty sci-fi looking buildings. I'm looking online, and apparently they used a building called the Bradbury Building, which makes me wonder if it has anything to do with a science fiction giant named Ray Bradbury. Probably not, but still an interesting coincidence. And apparently this building has been used for a lot of the old noir movies. So it kind of, it's a very interesting, very expansive looking building. Like, you can look up and it just, you see all the way up, and you see all these different levels to it. And it's almost like going into the Marriott or something at Dragon Con, and you're just like, and it automatically freezes you, and you're like, oh my God, I'm in another world. So definitely the architecture adds to it.
Russ, anything else you wanted to add in?
I think it's mostly, a lot of what we've talked about. I mean, if you think about even things that have been done recently, if you watched, I just recently rewatched Obi-Wan, right? And there's a whole sequence when there's a chase down in the city. Again, it's nighttime. It's amazing. You have nighttime and neon lights in a dense urban environment, and you can, and you throw in a little bit of, a hovercraft here or a ship, a craft going off in the distance, and it kind of all kind of plays into that same kind of, it's that same kind of vibe. They had actually Star Wars did it again with, God, what was it?
Well, Andor had a lot of those elements to it.
And in the prequel movies, I can't remember, it was the second one, I think. It had I think it was the Attack of the Clones. The first half of the movie was basically kind of like it was really like a sci-fi noir. The first maybe 45 minutes was, it was a mystery going down to the city, and what you really see again and again, it's nighttime. It's the dark, it's the neon against the dark and the rain, and these urban environments really seem to, it's sort of like it's the core blueprint for the characterization of that setting, and it just seems to draw you in. Darkness just by itself lends itself to, people, places, and danger, being obscured, being hidden, can come out of any place at any time for any reason, and you never really know what's there. So it adds a little bit of tension. It adds mystery. It obscures what otherwise would be visible in plain sight, and that seems to be kind of really one of the core staples, kind of no matter where you go.
So, looking at and talking about noir sci-fi, and let's stay on film and TV for a minute. I mean, there's a lot of choices to make. So, Lola, is there one that is kind of really a favorite for you, and that really defines the genre for you besides outside of Blade Runner?
Oh, well, there's so many. I guess The Matrix, although I guess you could argue, I don't know if it's noir in that it's got the darkness and the sci-fi and the desperation and all that. There's not really a gumshoe. And I guess there's some femme fatales. So you could argue whether that's film noir or not. But I mean, if we count it as noir, then yeah, The Matrix is one of my favorite movies in the world.
Russ, how about you?
Well, you mentioned it earlier, and I think it's worth kind of diving into a little bit, is, The Expanse and the character of Miller. Mm-hmm. Particularly in the first season, but, but I've also read most of the books, and Miller is, it's the narrative is split between Holden and Miller throughout, and the books are massive. I mean, it's almost a 600-page book. So you're really in the mindset of, Miller as sort of this, this broken down cop who's sort of, he's kind of on his last run, and he's your classic, alcoholic, burned, more of a burned out cop kind of, he's gotten just so cynical and jaded, but there's a beating heart buried underneath all that, all that oppression. And when you look, I think on screen, they really did a brilliant job of capturing, of the world building, and bringing it to life. And it's very, in its own way, it is sort of very Blade Runner-esque. He's always sitting at the noodle shops, and eating at the little, and wandering through the markets. And he's kind of, he's gaunt, and he's kind of world weary, and he's always got the hat, the hat, kind of the pork pie hat, kind of just dipped down, and he is caught up in what he thinks is, at the beginning, this, for those of you who haven't seen it, Miller is private security out on one of the asteroids in the belt, and he's given this assignment to sort of bring back this rich guy's daughter, has just sort of, seemingly has run away from home to play renegade, because she's like a spoiled brat, but it turns out to be something much more insidious going on there. And it gets, when he starts to investigate this sort of very, futuristic world. And for those of you who are not familiar with the setup with the Expanse, it's about 200 years in the future. Earth and Mars are the two dominant powers in our solar system, and the belt, the asteroid belt, basically it's basically like a coal mine in space, right? You go out and you literally mine asteroids for ore and for ice that's utilized throughout the system, and the belters are the working poor. They're basically, that's what they are. They're miners, and they're poor and they're desperate, and both Earth and Mars are basically, and they say they have their boots on our necks, right? We do all the hard, dangerous work that could kill us, but they have all the money. And Miller's sort of meandering through this ecosystem, and he takes his assignment begrudgingly because he's told to do it. But once he starts to sort of investigate this girl, she gets under his skin and he can't let go. There's just something about her. And he starts, in his mind, he starts to see her in his mind's eye, and he's having conversations with her. She's almost like a ghost who's sitting with her all the time. I mean, later he finds out that she's dead, and in a really horrible way. And then he really starts to go through it, and he's caught up in this sort of galactic lunacy and very large conspiracy that's much bigger than anyone realized was going on. And Miller is really this, he's world weary, but he's got experience that our other characters, at first, they don't necessarily, they just think he's like this burned out loser, but they also kind of sort of realize that, maybe maybe he knows a few things, and, he's sort of one of them, but sort of not. And you can just tell by his physicality and his actions that he's sort of self-destructive, and, he's going to take this case to the end, even when the powers that be have kind of told him, well, I know we told you to do this, but maybe it's time to let this go. And he won't. And even when he's fired, he keeps digging, and he keeps digging, because that's what guys like him do. That's Noir. You know what? I'm taking this to the end, no matter where it goes or who it affects, because in his own mind, he has his own code, and he's realized how far he's fallen. And it's almost as if getting to the end of this mystery is the last thing that he could do to redeem his soul. Because there's nothing left for him. He's got no kids. He's got no marriage. He's got no job, and he's taking it to the end, no matter how much danger it puts himself in. He doesn't care. And if he gets taken out before then, so be it. But that's all he's got left. And there's a certain amount of, I found myself really drawn to this guy. I mean, it can't end well for a guy like this. There's just no happy ending. It can't go well, but depending on how you define well, because for him, he's basically said, that's it. He kind of has accepted that this is his last run, and he kind of knows it. And there's something to sort of fascinating about watching someone who just says, you know what, I pushed all my chips in on the table, and I know there are no more chips. And he's going all the way to the end, and which allows him to take risks and go into dangerous places that almost anyone else would say, whoa, 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 whoa. I want to live to see tomorrow.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't do it. But he just keeps pushing and pushing. And so you get that mix of that the noir, the mystery, the danger, but also within this sort of larger and, expansive sci-fi setting. And there's also some horror elements in there. But when you watch it on screen, they really did an incredible job, I think, of the world building that really brought it to life. Certainly another character. And if you haven't seen the show, for those who haven't seen it, physics is a real element to the show. I mean, gravity really matters in a way that I don't think I've ever seen it in any sci-fi movie or show ever. Maybe now a little bit more going forward, but certainly not before. But it's also very present in the book as well.
Yeah, and I actually was on a panel with some of the science advisors and all for the show, and some of the writers talking about how important it was, what it took to do the effects for it, but also how difficult that made some of the storytelling, because it was like you can't just IFM away certain problems. You got to figure out how the physics really would work.
Oh yeah, it's really quite in that one element alone. It's just so brilliant how you just, we're used to saying, all right, go to hyperspeed, and pew pew and go fast, but in this show it's, gravity is real, and depending on what planet you're from, Earth has one gravity, Mars has another gravity. The belt is all artificial gravity, because if you were born as, in this belt, you've never been on a planet. You've never breathed, pure, pure oxygen, right? Everything's been filtered in. So they talk about it more in the books, where the characters, if you were born in the belt, they're very tall and thin just because of the effects of gravity, and they couldn't handle being on Earth or being on Mars, because the gravity would destroy them, and vice versa. It's very tough. And loose shrapnel, right? A pen gets loose, a wrench, a nail, a screw gets loose in gravity. I mean, and all of a sudden this little tiny piece of metal is a diabolical weapon that could pierce armor because of velocity and gravity and things that you never think about. And you watch Star Wars, it's, oh, the hyperdrive is broken and things pop and the gas pops out, and it's like, woo, it's just like an adventure. But meanwhile, in this show, in this series, if that happens, I mean, a piece of metal is going to just rip your face right off your head, because it's, because of of physics. And it's something that we never really saw. At least I never saw it before.
Yeah, that was one of those things that they put a lot into as well. So Elektra, how about you? Is there something film, TV for you from the sci-fi noir space?
I'm going to go with something a little odd. Another adaptation of Philip K. Dick, Johnny Mnemonic. It's a little on the outside, because Keanu Reeves plays Johnny Mnemonic, who's a data courier. He's cleared out some space in his brain so that he can carry really important data from one place to another. And he's very into doing a good job. He dresses the part the whole bit, and he takes a package for some folks from one place to another, and they fill him up with extra large amounts of data. So he really needs to deliver it and get it out of his head before he starts to have problems with it leaking. I'm not sure how the physics of that works, but just go with it. And it turns out that he's got the cure for the disease that is killing a whole bunch of people. And Big Pharma doesn't want the cure to get out, because, well, they're making too much money treating people for the disease for them to be cured. Reality. This is what life is like for us. It more money in treating it than in curing it. I've had situations like this before. It's easier to treat what's going on with you than to let you have surgery to fix it. Or it's cheaper for them to treat you than to pay for you to have surgery. So you've got Keanu with this thing in his head, and he goes from being a courier to being the guy that's trying to figure out how they can deliver this to the right place so that it gets to the people who need it. And he picks up some help along the way, and he's being chased by people who are hired to kill him so that the knowledge goes away. And it's on the side of cyberpunk, but it gets in a lot of noir elements. And it's a dystopic world. It's very dark. And it's really quite something. And it dings me on a lot of the noir elements, because he starts trying to figure out what's in his head and why are they trying to kill me? And then how can I get it out without the secret code? Because it's locked so he can't get it. That's fairly typical of these things. And, it's a fairly simple A to B type thing. It's like a detective trying to solve their own murder. And it was fun.
Yeah.
I realize it's not everyone's cup of tea.
I loved it.
It's mine, definitely.
Well, and there's two that I've got to at least throw in good word for. The first of which is Dark City. which we were talking about a little bit before we got started, which to me is a great and underrated film. Predating the Matrix, it has a lot of the ideas of the Matrix. What is reality? But it's also that murder mystery. It's got the setting, it's got all the elements. And the other one for me is 12 Monkeys, right?
Oh, yeah.
You got Brad Pitt, you got Bruce Willis.
Yes.
And especially in the film, getting that kind of Terry Gilliam twist to it, right? The time travel mystery and how that's going to work. That's two, I think, if you're talking about the genre, you really have got to look at, because both those have had a lot of influence, even though they were not necessarily major films.
Right. Now, I'm glad that you brought up 12 Monkeys. I forgot. I haven't seen that in a long time. And I thought one of the most brilliant elements of 12 Monkeys is, right, it's got, all the elements, right? It's got the time travel and the futurism. So it's got a little bit of that sci-fi, vibe to it. It's certainly noirish in that fact that, you've got this essentially an amateur sleuth who's sent to sort of discover, the mystery. But with the brilliance of it, at least I thought, is that, so Bruce Willis's character does the job. He was sent to find out where was the moment when the plague was unleashed that destroyed most of humanity. But his job was not to get there and then prevent it. It was just to identify the moment. So he does his job, and he and everyone else dies anyway. And yet he's, in his mission, he was successful. So the true heartbreak is that he did his job as well as anyone could do it, and everyone dies anyway. Whoa. That is heavy. That's noir right there. Noir pretty much means there ain't no happy ending.
So
that's French.
Well, what about books? And we've touched on some of this because, again, you can't talk about noir sci-fi without getting into Philip K. Dick, no matter what you do, because so much of what we consider noir sci-fi in film, and we've already mentioned a number of these, were adaptations, even if you get into things, as I go blank, but pretty much.
Butcher.
Which one?
Jim Butcher.
Oh yeah, Jim Butcher as
Harry
well.
Dresden is absolutely classic sci-fi noir. First person narrative of the guy, the detective who's in the yellow pages as a wizard. Mm-hmm. And he's solving mysteries, just doing it with magic.
Yeah.
And he's very noirish. In the first book, the femme fatale comes into his office and has a problem that she needs him to solve.
Yeah. And he's got a sidekick. He's got Bob, is that
Bob
his name?
Skull.
Yeah, he's got a sidekick. Mm-hmm. You gotta have a good sidekick.
If you're talking about books, although it was just adapted, so I'm not sure if you're familiar. So there's a series on, is it Apple or Netflix? So Dark Matter. By Blake Crouch. Now, I've read the book, and the book is very, very good. And I don't know if if you're familiar with the setup, but you've got this physicist who is, they talk about that he's this brilliant physicist, but he kind of settled into, instead of becoming super famous, he kind of took a job as like a high school physics teacher because he just didn't want to give his whole life to that career, and he just wanted to have a family. And one night he goes out for a drink. His buddy, who's very smart too, but not as good as him, wins the super duper award in physics. And he goes out to celebrate. And on his way home, our protagonist is kidnapped by this mysterious figure. And it sends this guy, our physicist, on the run. And he winds up being split off into the future, into these, essentially into parallel worlds, to try to find out what's happened, why it's happened to him, and who's after him, and what's going on. And it has this really kind of great setup where, he's being hunted by his past and his future, and all while he's trying to find out if it's possible for him to either reclaim what he had, or if there's another path forward for him. And it's one of the better sci-fi. It's not sort of classic noir in the sense that there's no private eye, there's no really cop in it, but our protagonist kind of becomes the amateur sleuth, but he's fighting for his own. Not only does he have to find out what happened and why, he has to use his physics knowledge and experience to sort of uncover the mystery, and then use that knowledge to resolve his issue while also trying to survive. So he kind of becomes kind of his own sort of, he's the amateur detective and a sort of like a MacGyver kind of thing, all blended into one, while he's being hunted down by, I don't want to kind of give it all away, but by folks who are trying to basically take what he has. And if you haven't, I started watching the show. My wife and I started. I haven't made it all the way through, but if you haven't, I would strongly recommend that you read the book. It's very good, very good.
And there's a lot about identity in there. I think maybe identity is another hallmark of noir. Just like
yes.
Blade Runner, are
Yes.
you who you think you are? And in the show you're talking about, well, there's a lot of people who may think they are who they think they are. There's a lot going on.
Elektra?
You want me to come up with more?
Well, I don't know if you had anything else you want to throw in there. So,
coming up more with cyberpunk at the moment. So give me a second.
well, I want to talk a little bit about Philip K. Dick, because again, that legacy. Scanner Darkly.
That's what I was just thinking of. You stole it.
More Keanu
That's
Reeves.
mine.
Absolutely.
Well, and the book, I was going to talk about the book. I read it in college.
So the book itself is, again, considering the 70s, considering the time, because I think it was 77 or 78, somewhere in there, when the book was done, was very, because again, this is very noir. It is very much about dirty cops. It is very much about all of this. But when we look at overall the works of Philip K. Dick, so much of what he produced was noir sci-fi. It was that mystery. And now we won't talk about how much of that had to do with the chemical substances he decided to ingest. But
Poetry. I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that you end up with noir sci-fi.
No, but I mean, I think that was very telling, is how much of it was very much noir sci-fi, and the fact we're still adapting those stories now on a regular basis.
Report was another one.
Minority Report, yeah.
Yeah, that's another
Total
really
Recall.
old,
But the one thing about Scanner Darkly I thought that was really interesting is when they adapted it, they did it with basically rotoscope. So it's live action animation. And I thought that gave
fun.
It was a fun, but it gave a very specific look and feel.
Scattered, very scattered. Like you don't know what's going on.
And you could have that feel of what's reality and what.
But it was different than anything else that was out, and it really sold the idea. It was
Like,
great.
Are you on drugs?
For noir.
Like, am I on drugs? What am I watching? And one of the things I was talking about identity, that's one of the things about the book and the movie is it makes you question your identity, the protagonist's identity, because he doesn't know. And in fact, to give you a true story, I read this in college and I was like, okay, so he is the guy. And then later, like in the 2000s, I was talking to someone and he was like, no, he's not the guy. And I was like, what? And I had like a complete freak out because I've been thinking for 10 years that he was the guy. And then I, went for another 10 years thinking, okay, he's not the guy. And then I was talking to someone else. They were like, yeah, he is the guy. And I'm like, is he the guy? Is he not the guy? And I was like having a crisis. And finally, I just had to sit down. I think I rewatched the movie. I was like, he is the guy. Okay. That was very upsetting.
So what other authors or books really scream noir sci-fi for you? Now, for me, the other one would be, of course, William Gibson and all of those series. But Lola, I'll throw this one to you first.
There is a book I loved. It's 30 years old. I had no idea it was 30 years old, but that makes sense because I was in college and that was 30 years ago. It's called Gun, with occasional music, and it's by Jonathan Lethem. And it's modeled to be like that gumshoe noir. Even the cover looks like one of those old pulp novels. And it's very much modeled that way. But it's sci-fi in that animals talk. So he's a gumshoe, but he's trying to get information from this, penguin. You see, this penguin, he knows what's going on. And I just remember I loved it. I haven't read it since then, but I just loved it to death. It was just so cool and something that just you didn't really see that much. So blatantly sci-fi, but yet, this whole 1940s aesthetic too. He went on to do more mainstream stuff, whatever's, but I still love this one.
I'll point to a book. It's by an author called Adam Sternberg. He wrote a book called Shovel Ready. It's about 10 years ago, and the setup is, it's more or less modern day. But a dirty bomb had gone off, killed a whole lot of people, and the world that we know, it's set around New York City. The world's been irradiated. He used to be a garbage man. And now his wife was killed, and now he's a hitman. But he winds up trying to getting hired, and he has to find this girl who's missing, who turns out she's been sort of kidnapped by this cult. But this cult leader kind of has like what was it? Oh, jeez, come on. What was the Willy Wonka sci-fi movie? A Ready Player One.
Right? Oh, yeah.
Right. But he's got that kind of a setup where he's got sort of this, he's got this plug-in world where you can kind of escape into this fantasy, but you've got this, very gritty, hard-boiled kind of guy who's very cynical, but there's still deep buried beneath him. There's a little bit of a beating heart underneath there somewhere in this very dirty, ruined kind of futuristic world, where it's very dangerous and, it's very hard. You really can't trust anybody and everyone's just trying to survive. Even within this horribleness, and even though this guy he's a hitman because that's what he could do at that stage, there was still a quest for humanity deep within the rubble and the ruins of this futuristic world. So I would definitely, if you're into that kind of thing, Shovel Ready by Adam Sternberg. It's definitely worth the time.
Elektra?
How about The Laundry Files by Charlie Stross? Those are very noir. And they feature a bureaucrat as detective. Now, many of the things he's going after tend to be a little bit on the, what's the right word? Lovecraftian.
That's what Wikipedia says.
But they are fun and they are very dark. And they are definitely detective and they're SF on the horror side of SF, but they are definitely
like paranormal.
They are very paranormal and they are very fun.
So I'm gonna throw two more out there that I've thrown out for years. One of which is Rich Kadri's The Grand Dark, right? So that one, and it's a bit grimdark, but it's also very much in that noir element. It's very much in a bit of a post-apocalyptic world, but it's also one where you can see it has very much a feel of post-World War II Europe. But that one is a great one. And I actually have recommended over the years, depending on what you like, to partner that with Michael G. Williams's A Fall in Autumn. And I know that there's a sequel coming out to Fall in Autumn. I don't know if it's out yet or not, which is also very much a noir sci-fi mystery set in a very far-flung future. But kind of the reason and this is just in my head, how I've partnered the two of them up, is you can almost see, because one of them is on a decaying Earth, the other one is in a decaying city floating above the Earth. But both of them are very much these noir mysteries that I read very close together as well, which are also two really fun reads. Well, fun depending on how dark you want to go.
Dark can be fun.
Oh, absolutely. So with kind of all of that in mind, right, is that, noir tends, you're never going to get that nice happy ending. The best you're going to hope for is that, at the end of it, most everybody's at least still in one or fewer pieces. But what is it for you guys that really brings this blend of the noir darkness, grittiness, the mystery, and what does sci-fi kind of add to that? What else can you do by lifting it and setting it into that setting? What is it for you that appeals to you for that?
I mean, putting it in a sci-fi setting allows a little bit of distance from the world that you live in now, so that you can you can examine stuff that's happening right now in the real. I mean, you could argue that we actually are starting to live in kind of a sci-fi noirish world ourselves. But the fact that, if you have things that are, whether it's on a distant planet or it's on a ship or it's a bit futuristic, having that distance from our day to day allows us, I think, allows me, it's my pathway in to stories that maybe sometimes cut a little too close to home. I mean, over the years, I've certainly watched and read my fair share of political shows, whether it's, what the West Wing or whatever. But now these days, I told my wife says, "Oh, maybe we should watch." I don't want to watch anything that has politics involved right now, because the world is, we're living it 24/7. If it was, set far off, 100 years, 200, 1,000 years from now, maybe it's a little bit different. You watch, Dune, for example. Certainly, it's not really noirish, but it certainly has its own political landscape to it. It's a little bit easier to ingest because it's not, even though the themes are basically the same as today, right? It's about power and class warfare and whatnot. But I think with sci-fi, taking me as the reader or the viewer out of my day to day and just transporting me somewhere else, it allows for a little bit of, emotional, spiritual, psychic distance that I can sort of accept what you're telling me a lot more easily, rather than just sort of, if I want to watch, the normal horror show, all I have to do is look out the window and turn on the news. And I really don't want to do that. So,
Elektra?
If I'm reading noir is a lot of fun because it's so easy to immerse yourself in it, because they're nearly all first person point of view. And you find out things when the protagonist finds out things, and you know what he or she knows, and you don't know what they don't know. And it's just much easier to immerse yourself in a book like that than in one that has 15 points of view that you're jumping in between, and you have to keep track of whose chapter is this now, and what do they know, and what do they don't know, and what am I learning from them. It's just a much easier book to read and understand. I love those books. I started reading mysteries and came to sci-fi after. And I love sci-fi more than anything, but combining those two genres just makes me happy.
Lola?
And so we've been talking about tropes, the hat and the darkness and everything. And some people may see that as limiting, that, you have this skeleton that you adhere to, and then you can put whatever you want on the skeleton, whatever kind of paper doll you want to make out of it. And I guess that can be limiting, but I think, like Elektra said, it's also comforting because you know what you're in for. This is going to happen in Act A, this is going to happen in Act B, and then at the end, this is going to happen. And it's like, it's a structure that you can dress however you want, and it's fun to write and read. It's fun for boys and girls and everyone in between.
I mean, it might not feel like an exact layering of sci-fi noir. But if you actually think about Batman, right? I mean, superheroes, you could argue maybe they're more fantasy, some of it's a little more sci-fi, but Batman, who doesn't have powers, uses high-tech gadgetry, right? That's far beyond what we really have. He's using, you could call it sci-fi, right? He's got the Batmobile, which is like some crazy hooped up car, and he's got the Bat plane and the Bat wing and the Bat cave with computers that can crack any code, anything. And no matter what he needs, there's always just a machine right over there that can do whatever he wants. And it's very noirish, and right, it's dangerous and it's mysterious. So Batman's been around for 80 years. So
Detective Comics, yeah.
Especially, I was going to say,
right. So this idea of this comforting kind of, there it is in its own way, and certainly for me, and I'm glad you said that, Lola. For me, the noir is comfort food for me because I just love that. I know when I'm reading noir or watching it, it's a jacket that you know how it fits. You know it fits, it's comfy. It might not be the right jacket for the weather, but it doesn't matter. It fits just right. And then, you can sort of accessorize as you need to. And there's something really quite, it's like you said, it's comforting but you can dress it up kind of however you like. And then if you're a sci-fi fan and, I walk in a lot of different worlds. I spent a lot of time with the traditional crime and mystery writers and readers. And I can tell you, overall, they don't want to hear about sci-fi like at all. They're kind of, I had to say it, they're a little snobby about it, broadly speaking. Whereas the sci-fi crowd is much more accepting of that blending because they're used to sort of immersive worlds and sci-fi kind of, even if it's an adventure, even if it's pure popcorn, there's always kind of a mystery kind of built into it. You got to figure out what the hero's really after and what the villain's really about and what it is. But you're right, the comfort food part of it. I mean, it's there.
Cozy crime. I just made that up.
That's it. Cozy crime.
I like it.
So yeah, that for me for sure.
Well, before we get out of here, I mean, is there anything else we haven't talked about? I'll give each one of you a shot to kind of throw out and say whatever we might not have touched on so far, because there's always a lot more stuff we can dive into. So is there something in terms of sci-fi noir we haven't hit on that you guys think we need to talk about?
There's a couple of movies that I think that are worth mentioning. If you've seen or haven't seen both, so Gattaca, which is really quite good, and Ex Machina, which are, to me, I think are like great sort of, almost like they're cousins or sister films, on both the ideas. Obviously Ex Machina, which is really kind of great in the idea of, should we create androids that are so lifelike you can't really tell them apart, but then do they have a right to be their own people, rather than just some sort of creation? And then with Gattaca, this idea of, having, being birthed naturally versus not becomes a real shift because of genetic manipulation and technology and fundamentally they both kind of harken back to what we were talking about before is, what it means to be human. And, are we losing how easy we can find ourselves individually and culturally losing that sense of, of humanity
and that's the identity I was talking about.
That's exactly right. And I think, and it's in slightly different ways, both of those movies, Gattaca and Ex Machina, both kind of hit on those sort of identity themes of, who are we? Do we have a right to be as we are, or the way others say that we should be, caught within a system that's starting to grow beyond us, and where we are going to have, once that system takes hold, we're going to have no capacity to overcome that system.
Elektra, anything we haven't hit on?
Well, if we're going to mention identity as a strong theme, I will recommend Orphan Black Echoes, because the entire theme of that is trying to figure out who you are and what your place is in the world, and trying to solve the mystery of where you came from. So, and that's got the shadowy organization. Very noir. It's a cousin to the original Orphan Black. God.
The original.
It's a cousin to Orphan Black, and it's on AMC, and it's lovely. So yeah, that's just a whole nother thing about the ethics of making people or just printing them out on a 3D printer. So yeah, but nice that it dovetailed so nicely into what you guys were talking about.
Lola, anything we haven't touched on?
Well, this is just a little bit of newsy news. I was on Wikipedia looking at Blade Runner 2049, and it said there's going to be a TV show on Amazon called 2099. And I was like,
No.
well, cool. Let's do it now. What are we waiting for?
Well, there's also a comic book series, a Blade Runner comic book series, which is quite good as well. Blade Runner is really kind of, it's finding a whole new generation of storytelling that I think generally they seem to be more or less, I think they're getting it more right than wrong, actually, which normally you'd think would be the opposite, but I think they're kind of starting to figure it out.
Nice.
Well, before we get out here, let's make sure everybody knows where to find you guys. Website, social media, that sci-fi noir release that they've got to have. So, Russ, I'll go to you first.
Sure. So you can find me at russcolchamiro.com. That's COLCHAMIRO. And you can find me on Facebook and Instagram and Blue Sky. But I will point out that I write sci-fi noir. I have a series, Angela Hardwick. It's just they're sci-fi thrillers, all in a noirish world. I kind of think of them a little bit as, you can't get away from, sort of Blade Runner and a little bit of Fringe, actually. There are 5 standalone novels. I reintroduced the world building and the characters in each novel so that you can start anywhere based on whatever plot you like the best. Angela Hardwick she's a private eye who takes on all the kind of cases that you think a private eye would take, but she also takes on cases that deal with androids and parallel universe and soul stealers and galactic madmen, all kind of set in this sort of futuristic kind of world. And all the mysteries for the most part start out at street level, and it's very gritty and grimy and dark, and expand into these very larger kind of complex conspiracies with lots of action and intrigue and suspense. And the first, Crackle and Fire, Fractured Lives, Hot Ash, Blunt Force Rising, and the 5th book, which comes out September 10th, is Trigger Point, which deals with Hardwick is hired by a very nasty pimp who has said that his best earner has been murdered. And for reasons I will not explain, Hardwick reluctantly takes on the case and finds herself caught in this conspiracy where the fabric of space-time is starting to physically erode, and how the murder of the sex worker and the erosion of space-time link together. Well, you'll just have to read and find out. And that's from Crazy 8 Press, and it's out September 10th.
Elektra, where can we find you?
You can find anything you need to know at untilmidnight.com. It's got links to all my socials, and I do most of my communicating with the world these days at Mastodon, where I'm Elektra at wandering.shop. I've got some short fiction out. You can find all the links to that on my website as well.
Lola?
My name's Lola Lariscy. I have a website, lolariscy.com. You can see some of my fiction there. I'm a very slow editor. I'm a fast writer, but slow editor. And I've been done with my latest book for a while, but then I sent it off to people to read. And one of my friends came back and said, that's not how science works. And I said, I don't care. But then I was like, all right. So I had to spend days on YouTube watching YouTube videos about how it's supposed to work. And then I got upset and deterred, and I just haven't quite gone back yet, but it's coming. It's happening.
And you can find me at jamespnettles.com, authoressentialsworkshops.com, creatingpros.com, and of course here at ConTinual. And we will see you again soon. Don't walk down any dark alleys unless there's plenty of neon.